There are things you need to educate them about. For example, I always hear the office in the home is a red flag. And I'm not going to say that it's not,
Mm,
but some practitioners won't even put that on a tax return because it is a red flag.
mm.
Well, you're doing your client a disservice.
Hi, this is Christian Jones, and you're listening to the ProMarketer Podcast. Whether you're in tax compliance, preparation, resolution, accounting, or whatever space or slice of our industry you're in, the ProMarketer Podcast is designed to bring helpful strategies and resources to you, to the conversation of how you're building your practice, building your firm, serving your clients. And we like to bring subject matter experts on to talk about their specialties, to talk about things that they're great at, things that they can share a wealth of knowledge with you on. And today is no different. We've got Dan Henn from the Tax Resolution Academy. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Great, Christian. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've had you before. I know we'll have you again. But Dan has a couple of different hats that he wears, but Tax Resolution Academy is the entity that we're going to focus on today. But Dan is an entrepreneur. He's a tax education speaker. He's an author of multiple books, one of which is No Holds Barred, Candid Talk About Small Business Success in Florida. 41 Dangerous IRS Tax Red Flags is a second. And then a third is Hidden Profits for Your Tax Practice. And Dan, you were a monthly columnist for Florida Today for a number of years. And you've
Right.
also got a total of 3 decades of experience in our space, assisting other tax firm owners, helping them grow their business. And you also own your own firm, which it lends itself to all of your experience that you practice what you preach and do everything that you talk about. So again, Dan, thank you again for coming on today's podcast. We're glad to have you. And the first question I want to hit you with, just to get us started, will hopefully lead to the bigger point we want to hit today. But just over your 3 decades of being in this tax industry, being in this space, I'd like to start by just asking you, what are some of the most significant changes you've seen over the decades as it relates to a tax professional handling IRS matters, resolving a tax debt, or just dealing with the IRS in general? I'd be curious for your take on that.
Well, it's surprising. I think the biggest change, obviously, is really more in just the regular tax prep side of things. We always have to deal with the tax law changes. And when it comes to handling a representation case, and I use the bigger umbrella representation for collections and exam. And when it comes to exam and collections, there really hasn't been a ton of changes. I mean, we had the excuse me, we have the changes from Fresh Start in 2012. There's been the Taxpayer First Act, the Revenue Reconciliation Act of 98 that kind of brought us appeals and some other rules. But outside of that, in terms of collections, exam, there hasn't been really a ton of changes. There are more really nuances in how to handle cases, as we learn new aspects, how to, as professionals, how to monetize the the profession, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
the two things that I talk about right now for the most part, one is doing audit protection or account monitoring from a
Mm-hmm.
collections perspective. And while the audit protection really is more on the tax prep side in trying to stave off or be prepared for those people that are looking to not get audited, but
Right.
want to have that extra protection if they do. And
Mm-hmm.
then two, the part that one idea that I've had recently is offering a service in being able to help people avoid those CP 2000 notices, those document matching notices, and the follow-up uh, notices that come with the extra kick in the pants that I call it, the 20% substantial understatement penalty, that there's an actual way that, if you set things
Mm-hmm.
up right, you can actually pull transcripts, compare it to the tax return,
Mm-hmm.
and try and stave that off. And I think that would be a service that people would be willing to pay for. But in the actual representation space, there hasn't been a ton of changes. I mean, they happen from time to time in little pieces here and there, but as any tax preparation professional would know, that I always jokingly say, well, there's not been too many tax changes over the last like decade, but there obviously has. And that comes into play a lot more for those who come to you that I usually will say you're going to have somebody on average will owe at least 2 or 3 years worth of tax years. And it's not uncommon that they'll also have 1 or 2 years of unfiled returns. And
Yeah.
so you have to obviously keep up with the tax rules. And that's where I say a lot of tax practitioners sell themselves short because
Right.
they should be. That's where in my hidden profits book that I talk about charging premium fees for
Right.
that type of work. So
Right.
it's those types of things that I think that stuff has changed in the industry, but it's a lot of the same, but the little nuances of
Yeah.
things here and there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, there's a whole push right now in a variety of different spaces to try and offer what we would call advisory types of services. And that can vary firm by firm, practice by practice with what those services may be. But I think maybe even talking a little bit more about how tax professionals sell themselves short, that maybe you're just focused on compliance and preparation, but you come across someone that's got these unfiled years and you don't know how to charge, you don't know how to service it. Maybe the rules haven't changed a lot, but you don't know the rules. And so, talk
Right.
about why it's important for tax professionals to stay up to date on both that process, but also the exam procedures. I know we've talked about them not changing a lot, but just what risks might they face if they aren't up to speed on that? Kind of both sides of that question.
Well, because of my area of specialty being in the representation world, they say 98% of EAs, 90% of CPAs don't do work that they actually need their license for. You need your
Mm,
license for representation, or at least most of like 98% of representation requires a license. And
mm,
for CPAs, the other side of it is financial statement audits. That's where they
mm,
need the license for. And not only that, but most professionals are leaving money on the table.
right.
I don't know if the listeners out there have heard that the tax prep is a commodity. A commodity that most people are usually price shopping. Then it's more of the race to the bottom on who can offer the cheapest price. And that's not where you want to be. I mean, if you're a licensed professional, you took the time to take a test. You've got to annually, biannually, triannually keep up with your CPE, and that's not cheap to deal with that. It's travel sometimes to places, it's being online for hours. And if you're a last minute person, probably doing some self study. And but you've got to keep master tax guides, you got to keep the other tools and resources, your software. You're keeping multiple years of a lot of this stuff that increases the value. And so when
Right.
it comes to the advisory services, as you put it, the what is it, the client advisory services, I think is the buzzword that is used in
Right.
the industry. And it's that extra stuff that people are willing to pay for. They're willing to pay more for that kind of work than the tax return. I always say the tax return is the necessary evil. It has to be done. But
Right.
if you can do something that's going to save people money in taxes, or you advise them in some way that's going to help them even save money, generate more revenue. I mean, we're the best advisors because if you run your own firm, you not only know the technical aspects of the tax laws, but you know how to run a firm in practice
Mm,
management, you know how to do the marketing, you know how to do the sales. So if you can learn how to do those things, you can actually be a great advisor to a business owner,
mm,
teaching them like we teach other tax professionals that you should be working on the business, not in the business.
right.
Teaching them how to delegate, how to become an entrepreneur,
Right.
and doing those types of things. But going back to your question, that when you finish a tax return, I have generated revenue equal to, if not greater than, the money by handling a case for a client, that I've earned more from them in handling the representation side than I did from the tax prep side. When I first
Right.
realized that and understood that, in some cases I've gotten the equivalent. I don't bill it this way, but I gotten the equivalent of 250, 500, $1,000 an hour or more. I mean, depending
Yeah.
on what needs to be done.
Right.
And what ends up happening is the low-hanging fruit is the client who comes to you, you prepare their return. There was something that got screwed up. They didn't make estimated payments. They didn't realize they were 1099 versus W-2. They changed a job and they didn't fill out their W-4 right. Any number of things that causes them to get basically blindsided with some big dollar amount. And you can see it
Right.
coming, especially if they've been a client
Mm.
for a while, or even looking on their last year's returns that they've gotten refunds and now they're going to owe. And the first question you should ask them is, do they have the wherewithal to pay this by April 15th? And
Right.
sometimes some people aren't going to be able to do that. Unfortunately, sometimes it also comes with waterworks. And that's why I always have a nice box of tissues in my office.
Yeah.
But
Right.
but when it comes to handling these types of cases, unfortunately, most practitioners either they will add the Form 9465 for an installment agreement to the tax return and either don't charge anything and say it's part of the tax return, or they'll
Right.
charge some per form fee, 25, $35, and it's worth a lot more than that. I
Right.
don't use the Form 9465 anymore. I either use the online payment agreement tool at the IRS, or I will call the IRS to set up a payment plan. And
Yeah.
at a minimum, at least in my purview, that's 250, $500 or more. And I've gotten that depending on what's going on in their
Right.
situation. So you could,
Right.
the average, what the last average I saw on a tax return was somewhere just an individual return was just under $300. If I can turn that into a $500 representation case, and it's surprising, it's many times most people say that would be the more valuable thing is getting the IRS off their butt. And they'll pay the $500 after they
Right.
just paid you $300 for a tax return. So you've more
Right.
than doubled your revenue off of that client. Or
Right.
secondarily, you've prepared their return and they come back with a notice a
Right.
year later that says, hey, you forgot this document. Now, as long as it didn't turn out that they gave you that document and you screwed up, if they didn't give you that document, now that's on them. And I've had many a practitioner that say, oh, that's just part of the original tax prep. And that's no, that's not. If you use engagement
Right.
letters and you're using a standard engagement letter, that engagement letter should say that the scope of the work ends
Mm.
when you deliver the return, and that gets
Right.
filed with the IRS. So
Hmm.
now have a separate engagement that you should be charging them for.
Right.
And for me, in my practice, I start at 750 for that. Uh,
Mm.
and so you've got a lot of practitioners who are leaving money on the table. Now, obviously, if they gave you the document and you screwed it up, and then
Yeah.
obviously
Sure.
that's on you. You have to bite the bullet on that one. But
Right.
and then not to mention that there's opportunities to look for penalty abatements. Do they have
Hmm.
either first time penalty abatement or potentially reasonable cause? So
Mm.
there's money to be had. And it's not, I'm not the person who's going to be the one who's taking advantage of somebody. I don't do that. But I'm
Hmm.
providing a service that is valuable and is worth, my time. And
Hmm.
most people will pay it. Of course, just like
Mm.
anything, there's going to be some people who are going to scoff at the price and will always look for somebody cheaper, and that's fine. That's not necessarily the kind of person I want to work with anyway. But when it comes to that, you prepare their return. So if you prepare their return, they owe money. There's a value to that. They should be charging extra for that. And then if they come back to you with notices later, that's taking your time. There's
Right.
value to that. And so it's not uncommon,
Right.
especially if it's an existing client, you can get an extra, I don't know, 250 to $1,000 out of that client.
Right. Right.
And it helps make up for sometimes some of the extra time you had to put into something. So
Right.
it's that extra kind of money that people are leaving on the table, not to mention the person who comes in off the street that I mentioned
Yeah.
earlier who owes money or has a notice. They can
Right.
tend to be more, especially if you have to file back returns. I mean, it's easy to get 2,500, $3,500 off a case. And you handle
Yeah.
one or two of those, what could you do with an extra, say, three, five, $7,000?
Right.
Even if you just did that a month.
Right.
That pays some bills. That not only
Yes.
pays the office bills, but it gives you a little bit extra that you can use for your family, for vacations, for your retirement, whatever it is. So,
Right. And there's a difference between being opportunistic and kind of like a snake that you're nickel and diming people for everything and seeing the value and seeing and connecting the dots of, again, resolving pain and resolving stress for people. And I think that is a disconnect for a lot of tax pros is that they just may not realize fully the value of kind of, again, getting your return to done is important. And sometimes people have returns that haven't been done, but it's just trying to say, if the client doesn't understand or if they're stressed out, you as the professional should know on the scheme of things that, it's hard to maybe equate them, but resolving some of those stressors of an IRS letter or unpaid whatever, all of that has a premium on it. It should. And
right.
not everyone has that. And so my next question to you, Dan, is, in your fast start boot camp that does include a bunch of CPE, I think it's got 16 hours of CPE. Would that be something that people would be trained on? Would they come away having a better understanding of how to position this in their firm, how to bake this into their agreements, how to have maybe those service agreements if they don't have those to begin with? What would someone come away from that fast start boot camp with? Is it stuff in this area or others, or what could you, add as an expectation for the
Well,
listeners?
the Fast Start Boot Camp is primarily on the collections side of the house in terms of our representation. That's probably about, I don't know, 75, 80% of the material that we have. But Fast Start Boot Camp is 2 days of continuing education. We spend the first 4 hours basically talking about marketing, how to handle the sales aspect of it. Then we
Yeah.
talk about client intake. So we've got that process, and then we work into the last 12 hours is and the last piece of that is actually how to quote fees, how to get an
Mm,
idea
mm,
on, not that, we're obviously not doing anything that's colluding in terms of fee quoting. It's just how to give you an idea on, ballpark ranges, example fees that people
mm,
charge out there for, and then obviously you
mm.
charge what you feel comfortable with. But the last 12 hours are then all the technical aspects where we start the basic mechanics of how a case comes about, what kind of starts the process. Then we go into how we calculate the numbers, and then we teach the three main resolution options in installment agreements, currently non-collectible offer and compromise, and then we end with appeals. Because appeals is not, if you're going to handle a lot of more complicated cases, you're more likely to end up in appeals probably close to 50% of the time. But if you handle just general easy
Mm.
cases, somebody
Right.
owes $50,000 and they can pay it through a payment plan, your chances are you're not going to end up in appeals, since they changed some of the rules back in early 2020
Mm.
in terms of how they can set that up. But the boot camp is designed to basically get somebody started. Now,
Yeah.
my focus is really more on the practice owner, but it's also a good class for those that have other professionals, support professionals. Obviously, it's better if they're licensed, but they don't have to be. Obviously, if they're going to be a support professional and they can help with getting the numbers together, asking clients questions, and how to prepare the forms and doing that kind of stuff. So if you have a bigger office and you've got a professional who's not licensed, this would be a good class for them. But if they're licensed, that makes them even more valuable to you, because
Right.
now you can put them on a power of attorney. They're the ones that can
Mm.
call the IRS to get transcripts or deal with a lot of the aspects of handling the IRS. Because as the practice owner, the whole working on versus in, you shouldn't be actually
Right.
handling all the details of a case. You should be handling the high level aspects of things, getting those cases in, maybe wrapping up some of the cases. The everything in between should be your support staff. So
Right.
it's not uncommon that I will have two, three people from one office who come to learn how to handle that, and then we teach them. Basically, I like to kind of call it more as a to Z. Obviously, in 16 hours, we actually have our course curriculum is 21 hours, or excuse me, 21
Mm.
classes, and each class being 2 hours, so they're 42 hours. And then we have over 100 hours of continuing education that we teach. So there's a lot
Wow.
more to learn than just this 12 hours of technical and 4 hours of the marketing, practice management,
Yeah.
sales, the soft skills
Right.
type stuff.
Yeah, I love that. And I like the angle of whether it's support staff or the firm owner themselves. That's another kind of thread I hear a lot about, and I think a lot of people need is maybe they're going to come to this and say, "Hey, Dan, that sounds great, but I'm drowning and getting unstuck in your firm, like getting unstuck from a place where kind of the way I've heard it said a few times is you don't like the business you built. You don't like the way it's going and you want to try and get it to a place where it's healthy, it's more sustainable. You're not going from both feast and famine to silence and almost burnout collapse, you know? And I think even some of the things you're mentioning about training a team, equipping that team, and not being the one that has to touch and do everything, which is just exhausting. It's exhausting in this
Right.
business with all the things you've got to keep clear and softwares, right? And so I
Right.
love that angle.
Yeah, and then let me add, Christian, just to that point is that the the having the team. The other thing that's nice is that with handling representation cases, it helps fill in some of those gaps because the
Right.
standard tax professional earns anywhere from 50 to 75% of their revenue in the first 4 months of the year. And if they want to work the rest of the year, they can fill it in with doing things like tax planning,
Right.
the client advisory services. But
Right.
representation is another a good thing that you can fill in those
Yeah.
gaps. You want to get the better rate per hour, if you will, type of work, something
Mm-hmm.
that's going to earn you more than $50 an hour or something of that nature. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where the
Mm-hmm.
representation can help fill in some of those gaps. And
Mm-hmm.
there's many times, many of these cases, I've gotten cases done as quick as an hour
Right.
to as long as 10, 15, 20 hours. And the more complicated they become, the more involved they are. You generally get a case done in I'll say under 10 hours. And then you obviously
Mm-hmm.
bill your accordingly for that. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot more to be had. And on top of that, the last piece I'm going to add here is the nice thing about representation, and obviously it's now becoming that way even with the tax prep, but you don't have to be chained to the desk. It's the actual piece that
Right.
I get a lot from the almost retirees that are looking for something that they can do kind of on the side, earn some money. They can go buy
Right.
a Starlink satellite and the RV and then travel around the country and do that kind of work because most of these people realize and understand that they can do this remotely and that
Right.
they're going to work with somebody remotely. And if you set yourself up with the right technology, it's really easy to do.
Right. I love that. I love that. Let's talk a little more specifically about some of the red flags. If someone's not aware of these red flags, and you were going to go through your hit list, your top hitters, based on what you've written, based on your experience, what are some of the most dangerous IRS tax red flags that tax professionals should be educating their clients about and around?
Well, I always, obviously the term red flag was an eye-catching name. I personally don't
Right.
like using that, even though
Mm,
that's, part of the title of my book. But it's the word and a phrase that people know and understand. And so there are things that you need to be more, educate them about certain things.
mhm,
Like, for example, I always hear that the office in the home is a red flag. And I'm not going to say that it's not,
mm,
but, and there are some practitioners that won't even put that on a tax return because
mm,
it is a red flag. And it's like,
mm,
well, you're doing your client a disservice. If they meet the criteria, and obviously everybody's more, there are people are all over the spectrum where they, you say you have an office in the home, we'll take it, or some might be more stringent that you really need to meet to the letter of the law. And that's regardless of the situation, that's a personal preference. But if
mhm,
they're entitled to it, then claim it. So
mhm,
it's those types of things that people need to be aware of, but teach them how to document that, how to make sure that they meet the criteria, that they don't have the couch or the bed in the office, that they don't have the baby toys and the bouncy house things and that kind of stuff in the office, that they meet the requirements. Another
mm,
thing would be the roundedness of numbers. It's not uncommon
mhm,
that you will have a practitioner, or I should say, a entrepreneur, business owner, client who will come to you and they're so busy that they calculate their numbers and they round
Mm,
up or they round down. And
mm,
they'll give you things that'll end in 1200 or 3000 or 1250, and you'll have eight numbers like that on a return. That is a hey, look at me type of situation. When
mm.
they have multiple years of losses, it try to be more exact. When you have losses, then you need to make sure that you get them to document the business purpose. Make sure that they're having a bank account. Make sure they're dotting the I's and crossing the T's to make sure that it's not looked at as a hobby, that they can beat an audit, that they have an
Right,
actual for-profit business, even if it's generating a loss.
right,
So
right.
it's some
Mm,
of those types of things that I cover in my book. Things about 1099s, the 1099K. That's the biggest thing lately, especially since the IRS changed the rules. Actually, I should take that back. Congress changed the rules, but IRS
mm,
has basically kicked the can down the road for a few years
mm,
because the threshold
mm,
was supposed to go from 20,000 to 600, and they finally settled on this coming year it's going to be 5,000, and then they're going to stair step it down to 600 over a period of years. But
mm.
making sure that you ask your clients for that, because when nowadays it's easy for us to opt out for paperless, and when you say you're going to go paperless, guess where all those documents reside? They reside in your account with them online.
Right,
You are
right,
not going to get something in the mail. Chances are you may not get that 1099. Most of us don't get the 1098T from our college students because it's in
right.
their account online. And so, unless you specifically ask for that, you have to go into your account and get those documents. That's what's going to get people to kick in the pants.
Mm,
And when you look at the document, because I had this one time, I had one of my clients. They've been doing their stuff for years. They had
mm,
their 1040 with a Schedule C. They had two C corporations, and then all of a
mm.
sudden they get this notice for $19,000. That's why I call it the heart attack notice, the CP 2000. And
Yeah.
they got
Mm,
this notice, and it turned out that they opened up a Square account for this taxi business
mm,
that they were running out of the C corporation, but Square wouldn't let them put it in the EIN of the
mm,
C corporation. So what does she do?
mm.
She puts it in her social, not thinking anything of it. As far as she's concerned, all the money's going into the business bank account. And
Right.
that's all well and fine and good. It's just that the 1099 is coming
Yeah.
in her name and social security number. She never gave it to me.
Right.
We didn't report it. And so therefore we got the notice. And of course, we got it in 2 consecutive years because by the time we got it, she'd already done another year. But I was able
Right.
to send documentation in and eventually beat that and show that the income was reported elsewhere. And it's those types
Right.
of things that it's the things that you gotta, it's really about educating
Right.
yourself as a practitioner. That's why we
Mm,
have to do the continuing education. That's why I love going
right.
to the IRS tax forum every year because
Mm,
I usually get a few good little nuggets of stuff.
mm,
I know you guys go and a sponsor there as well. But
mhm,
doing
mhm.
doing that, getting that education, and then transferring that education to your clients. And then if we even want to go a step further, the ways that you can help educate your clients is record videos, create courses, monetize that even in a different way, either as a client benefit or something you can sell as a $20, $30 course that
Right.
people would buy.
Right.
And people would be willing to pay for that. It's interesting. So I'm always looking
I love
ways that
that.
we can try to monetize stuff because especially once you create the course, you create it
Right.
once, you need to obviously look at it and update it, should be annually. You could have that out in the cloud somewhere and
Yes.
earn some basically passive income because you don't have to do anything for that. And sometimes it can be a lead magnet for other people to come into your business.
Exactly. Oh, I love that. Well said. Let me ask you one more final question, Dan,
Sure.
just because I want to make sure I get you out of here on time. If someone was just starting out a tax resolution wing of their business or a new firm today, how can they best prepare for the challenges that they're going to face, both with exams, elections, et cetera? Just what would you give to someone that was considering moving into this space?
There's a few different aspects, and it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg. You still
Mm,
have to get some of this stuff done. The biggest thing is obviously the education, not only the education on the technical side. So you need to know how to handle cases. And sometimes the best way to do it is to just by doing it,
Hmm.
handling some of those cases and sometimes learning, even if you want to charge lower fees. I've had many of our members do that where they've charged lower fees to start with those first few cases because they don't feel like the client should pay for their education, and I'm okay with that. As long as you realize eventually and you get to your perceived value later, which most of them do, and getting that technical education. Then the other aspect of it, and again, this is part of the working on the business as opposed to in it,
Hmm.
is building the systems, building processes and procedures, having checklists, cheat sheets. That's why
Right.
we have our tax resolution systems book that my buddy and former partner Jason Bowman had put together. And I'm in the process of updating that book for a third edition to include some
Mm.
exam related type stuff in there.
Mm.
But it's 300 pages worth of checklists right now, in mostly in the collections area. And there's different things that it covers on client intake, the what is it, quoting fees, a little bit of some sales and marketing, how to hire some people, so that it covers a bunch of different aspects of basically starting a practice. But don't start yourself too cheap on, because one of the things that I learned in having a practice is looking at where I am now today versus when I went out on my own 15 years ago, is that that's the one thing that I wish I had done, is starting my fees here instead of here, because
Right.
I was worth more than
Right.
I was giving myself credit for. And not only that, but typically when you're charging here versus here, when you charge lower fees, you're going to get crap clients. It just happens. And
Right.
the people who are paying more money, they're obviously expecting a much better professional service from you.
Right.
But at the same time, they're more willing to be engaged in the process. And I
Right.
hear that from practitioners all the time. I've got this person who has been ghosting them or not responding to them in some form or fashion, or really slow in responding. And of course, it's not a foolproof system. You're going to get those even at higher prices too. But the thing that you have to realize and understand is that
Mm.
the work that we do has a value. You have a worth. You control everything in your practice. That's another aspect of it. Clients don't control that. The only thing they control is whether or not they want to work with you. And
Mm.
and even at that, you still have the control whether or not you want to work with them. Okay?
Right.
Because the best word you could ever say to somebody is, "I'm sorry, you're not the right fit."
Mm.
If there's something that just makes you feel queasy, sick to your stomach in some form or fashion, don't work with them. That's another
Right.
thing I've heard from many a practitioner that just says, I just wish I hadn't have taken that client on, because they're looking at more of the dollars and they need the money than thinking that, hey, there's a lot of bells and whistles going off. Like the guy that I talked to, what was it, about a year and a half ago, that he was wanting me to handle his IRS audit that he'd already been in the process of. And he's telling me about all of these things and ways he's been hiding money or not reporting money. And it's like, yeah, I was just like, yeah, that's not the kind of case that I want to work on. And there are
Right.
people out there like that, but I think overall most Americans want to do the return. They want to get it done right. They want to be above board.
Mm.
And if they end up having to pay a little bit in an exam, they're willing to deal with it to a certain degree. And again, that's where you get your money. You're more likely to go to appeals in an exam than you are necessarily on the collections side. But
Hmm.
again, learn, do the education, and
Mm.
make sure you get your systems, policies, or your procedures and stuff set up so that you can lift yourself out of the equation, have other people who can handle these repetitive tasks, so you can do the higher dollar work and do the marketing, do the sales, and grow your practice.
I love it. And I think a great segue to end on is to also encourage people to consider jumping on that Fast Start Boot Camp, which is again 16 hours of CPE. And Dan, you're also going to have an event in 2025, June 18th to the 20th out in San Diego. If I wanted to register for that, is there a link we can drop in the show notes for our listeners?
We're still working on that, but that is my Tax Rep Defender Odyssey
Okay.
event
Okay.
that we'll be having. I do two events a year. I do that one, and that one will be in June this year, and the other one is the Tax Pro Profit Maximizer Expo in November.
Okay.
This one that we're working for in San Diego is going to be designed to be more case study type of approach, where we can
Yeah.
have some, and it's basically again getting the client into what do we do when we're done with them in handling some collections, some exam type cases.
I
So
love that.
I think I call it, give me 1 second, I can tell you here, it's the TDO, what do I call it here? The TDOCPE.com. So that's where you will
Okay.
find that TDOCPE.com. The Fast
Okay.
Start Bootcamp is just that, faststartbootcamp.com, that you can
Okay.
find out further information. Got one coming up here. And I do that Fast Start Bootcamp, I do it live and in person. So I've got one coming here at the end of January in Orlando, as well as we do them online. I do various formats. And because it's all day, I do an Eastern time zone one. I usually will do a Pacific time zone or something that will be more accommodating to our friends out west.
I love it. Okay. We'll get all those links added to the show notes, guys. And so please, scroll down there, connect with Dan and his team, Tax Resolution Academy. You've got a couple of options with live events and obviously the boot camp, which we'll have the link as well to go and dig in more, to get prepared, to get ready and make 2025. Yeah, like one where you serve your clients better and also one where your business brings in more revenue for good, meaningful work that you're doing that you might just not see as clearly as you should. And that's where Dan can help. Dan can give you a lot of resources to get moving that direction. So, Dan, this won't be the last time I'm sure we speak in 2025. I'm sure we'll have you on again to talk about something else. But thank you again for your time. Thanks for, right at the first of the year, jumping on with us and doing this podcast. We
No,
appreciate it.
I appreciate it, Christian. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be here. It's always, I've known you for a number of years now, so I always
Yes.
enjoy the opportunity to be with you and chat.
Oh, yeah. Me as well, Dan. Me as well. All right, guys. Check out the rest of our podcast. We've got more coming up, other ones from last year that I think you'd really enjoy. And again, we hope to see you soon and good luck as you start your year.